It is November 14th, 2016, and this is HackHappy's weekly vulnerability report. This week we have 30 vulnerabilities from 11 vendors. Number 11, Google Chrome. Has a flaw that lets remote users obtain potentially sensitive information and execute arbitrary code. Number 10, Microsoft. And when it rains, it pours. So let's get through this. First, we have a flaw in the Windows Secure Boot that lets physically local users bypass security restrictions. Microsoft Virtual Hard Disk Driver lets local users modify restricted files to gain elevated privileges. Microsoft Graphics Component flaw lets remote users execute arbitrary code and obtain potentially sensitive information. SQL Server flaw lets remote users conduct cross-site scripting attacks, and remote authenticated users obtain potentially sensitive information and gain elevated privileges. Windows Common Log File System Driver Object Memory Handling flaw lets local users gain elevated privileges. Windows Authentication Methods has multiple bugs that lets local users obtain potentially sensitive information, and remote authenticated users deny service and gain elevated privileges. Windows Kernel API Permissions bug lets local users gain elevated privileges. Microsoft Office has multiple flaws that lets remote users execute arbitrary code, obtain potentially sensitive information from memory, and cause denial of service conditions. Microsoft Windows Bugs lets local users gain elevated privileges and remote users execute arbitrary code. Microsoft Video Control File Processing Object Memory Handling error lets remote users execute arbitrary code. Windows Kernel Mode Drivers has multiple flaws that lets local users obtain potentially sensitive information, bypass ASLR security restrictions, and gain elevated privileges. Microsoft Edge has multiple flaws that lets remote users obtain potentially sensitive information, access files, spoof content, and execute arbitrary code. That last one sounds a little dangerous. Number 9, Sophos Web Appliance has an input validation flaw in logs page that lets remote authenticated users execute arbitrary commands on the target system. Adobe. The Adobe Connect input validation flaw in events registration module lets remote users conduct cross-site scripting attacks. Adobe Flash Player type confusion and use after memory errors lets remote users execute arbitrary code. Number 7, Exponent CMS has an input validation flaw and drag and drop a re-rank function that lets remote users inject SQL commands. Number 6, IBM. The Rational Team Concert Input Validation flaw lets remote users conduct cross-site scripting attacks. Rational Rhapsody Design Manager Input Validation flaw lets remote users conduct cross-site scripting attacks. Rational Quality Manager Input Validation flaw lets remote users conduct cross-site scripting attacks. Rational System Architect Design Manager Input Validation flaw lets remote users conduct cross-site scripting attacks. AIX unspecified flaw in LVM LQuery LV lets local users obtain root privileges. Ouch. F5. Big IP ASM Proactive Bot Defense HTTP header processing bug lets remote users cause a target system to crash. Big IP TCP packet processing memory leak lets remote users deny service. PHP has multiple flaws that may let remote and local users execute arbitrary code. I'm gonna have to look into this one a little bit deeper because I'm kind of curious what's going on with this one, since PHP has so widely used. There could be a lot of servers out there affected. Number 3, HPE. The KeyView SDK has a buffer overflow and memory errors that lets remote users execute arbitrary code. OpenView Network Node Manager code execution bug lets local users gain elevated privileges. And the OpenView Network Node Manager input validation flaw lets remote users conduct cross-site scripting attacks. The CA Service Desk Manager has an input validation flaw in qbe.eq.ref_num parameter that lets remote users conduct cross-site scripting attacks. And lastly, but certainly not least, OpenSSL contains multiple bugs that lets remote users cause the target application to crash. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this week's vulnerability report. I do thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe so you get notifications of new videos, and I will see you guys on the other side.